Hi, Tessa. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I was muted. Hi.
Don't worry. Everything sounds good. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling from New York City, and there's so much construction going on outside my office that I'm in this like soundproof booth that looks like a prison cell in the middle of the building.
Well, if you're in
If
New
I look
York,
weird, that's why.
if you're in New York, it's never quiet.
I know.
It's
It's in
always noisy, even at 4 in the morning.
it's in there's all this scaffolding that they take down and put back up about
Yes.
10 feet in front of my office. And so it is not a good place to record any kind of podcast. So I
I
found this
don't know.
little booth.
It makes it a bit authentic.
That's true. I guess it depends on how irritated your listeners get with background noise. Some people are fussy and some people kind of like it, makes it interesting.
Whenever there's background noise, I always weave it into the conversation
Mm.
that people understand it's a normal thing. You're in New York. You made time, even though there's noise in the background. You've stuffed yourself into the smallest room in New York and you're doing a podcast. So we appreciate you for doing that.
Of course.
So I read up on your background, very interesting background.
Oh, thank you.
And I never heard anyone ever talk about being in a relationship with their career. That's the
Yeah,
first time I've ever heard that phrase, and I loved it. I've never heard that before. So, what sparked this insight about being in a relationship with your career?
honestly, I think I have kind of this weird background as a social psychology professor, but I also teach close relationships at NYU, and I have for a while. And I started seeing this kind of strange parallel between the world of work and the way we talk about relationships, such that they are morphing over time. So,
Yes.
people would come to me and they would say things like, I'm dealing with online dating and catfishing and icing and simmering. And then someone would call me up from the Wall Street Journal and be like, what do we do about icing and simmering and catfishing when it comes to showing up to a job interview? I'm like,
Yes, that's
these
funny.
things are starting to kind of overlap. And then all these complex emotions people have at work, they're just like how we feel about someone that we're falling out of love with. And I just started to see so many parallels in these kinds of different things that I'm doing in my career that I thought, why not just write a therapy book about therapy with your job?
That's
Just kind of
very
own it, own all
interesting.
the messy, complicated emotions and so forth.
It seems as if the way we think about our careers has significantly matured over the last, say, 40 years. Because if I think back to discussions you would have with executives about their careers, they would treat their careers as if it was something that they just lived in,
Yeah.
but they really experienced emotions when they went home.
Hmm.
And they would never think about emotion in the workplace and feelings. Is it good that we treat the work as a place where we can explore these things? I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, what are the boundaries? What's appropriate? And then this kind of gets into this messy conversation of what is a boss's job around
Yes.
regulating that. I think we know from research that most of the stress, most of the emotions we feel, the contagion of that stuff goes from work to home, and that effect is stronger than from home to work. So if you have a fight with your boss, the people who are going to suffer from that are your children and your spouse, and that stress contagion is stronger and more consistent than, say, if you have a fight with your spouse and then you take it out on your coworker. And the reason is simple: we just spend more time at work than we do at home. And so I
Yes.
think thinking of a job as something that we do, not something that we feel and have a relationship with, is just a little bit of like we're just, that's just not true. We have all
Yes.
kinds of these relationships. That said, I think there is a lot of messy conversation about bringing your whole self to work and how much emotion is it appropriate to experience and expect other people to deal with and be trained to even manage. And I've done a lot of work in the well-being space around how you can't ask your manager to be your
Yes.
therapist. It's not appropriate to do that. And so, on the one hand, we're feeling these things. On the other hand, we're kind of struggling with like, what are the boundary conditions in which it's appropriate to think about or discuss these things and with whom. So I think it's definitely kind of a complex issue for sure.
So let's think about, let's explore this, right? Because you kind of specialize in awkward relationships, right?
Yep. That is my favorite thing to study, making people feel
Well, your
really
significant other
uncomfortable.
must be really happy then because you can handle everything, right?
I mean, I do get like a pleasure out of watching awkwardness that is probably not normal. Like, who
Well, you're
research
doing it for
ideas?
academic reasons. It's for
Yes,
mankind, right?
that's right. Exactly.
I mean, I follow the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and I have friends who are 18 years old, kids from my neighbors and so on. It would seem to me that nothing is off the table today when it comes to discussion. So, what qualifies as awkward today? Because I could tell you
Ooh.
what qualifies as awkward 20 years ago, but not today.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Awkwardness, so we're starting to do more research on this in my lab. Awkwardness is something that it takes two. And so we kind of think of it as like a little bit of a dance between two people. And
Yes.
really kind of what's different about what's awkward now than say in the past or even something internal like anxiety is it's all about this kind of unresolved nature and the lack of social script of what one ought to do.
I like that. It's
You
relative.
introduce, yeah, it's super relative. And what we're finding is that people really perseverate on their awkward moments. I mean, we have one study where someone said they called a waitress by the wrong name 20 years ago and they're still thinking about it, and partly
Wow.
because it's an unresolved kind of discomfort that we don't have a social script of how to get out of it. Does it just require the person who's awkward? Does it require their partner? What does a successful resolution for awkwardness even look like? And do we even both agree of kind of what the peak moments of awkwardness are? But we do know that people can, they live in these awkward moments pretty, consistently, and they often go unresolved, and people kind of run away. Sometimes quite literally, they run away from the awkwardness because they don't know what to do or say. And I think it's that lack of resolution that makes them unique and kind. And I do think it's a little bit of a dance. It takes two people to be awkward. One person on their own can't really, they can be anxious, they can be uncomfortable, but awkwardness is a inherently interpersonal process.
So the way I'm going to think about it is there's no set standard for what is awkward. It's like an index, like a stock exchange. Well, today I feel more awkward than yesterday, or less awkward, but everyone's got their own stock exchange and they're all at different levels.
I
Is that a
love
good way to
that.
think about it?
I love that metaphor of the stock exchange. There's no such thing as objectively awkward, right? It's
Yes.
relative. And I do think some people solicit awkwardness from others. Some people are just really good at making others feel awkward. They don't give off clear social cues. And some people are really good at regulating awkwardness. So when someone else is awkward, they're very good at kind of laughing it off, making jokes, kind of getting those emotions back to baseline. And that is a bit of an individual difference that we don't fully understand yet, but I think is super interesting.
I like that thread you're going down because I have a client who's quite senior in the tech world and he's always complaining about everything, right? And it took me a long time to figure him out. Whenever I give him a solution, it doesn't help him because of his childhood. The only way he'd get attention is by complaining. And his identity is around getting attention by complaining. That's how he gets attention. So when you solve the problem for him, you break his identity because then he doesn't know how to get attention. So we're to find other mechanisms for him to get attention, which is how do you get attention by adding value, by helping people
Yeah.
versus complaining. So in this situation, he would create a lot of awkwardness because he's always complaining about his wife, his children. Then I realized that, awkwardness has many layers underneath it. We got to really strip it out and see why is this awkwardness taking place? Because it's very easy to say, well, let's just fix the problem. But then there's a whole new problem being created. This guy just checks out, right?
I love this idea that I'm going to play with this idea that someone has an identity
Yes.
at work or just in life as part of their personality. And in order for them to scratch that itch and to fulfill their identity needs, they have to engage in a behavior that creates awkwardness. I don't think that's ever been explored scientifically, but I'm sure we can kind of think of lots of examples of how people have weird identities that
Yes.
in order to fulfill their identity needs, it requires them to put people in uncomfortable situations, probably often inadvertently. Like you could even think of like a micromanager probably has some identity needs, and in order for them to feel like they are fulfilling their identity needs as someone who has great attention to detail, they destroy the soul of all of their direct reports
Yes.
by hovering in their Google Docs all day long. And it's really not about, the interpersonal component at all. It's about their own identity
Identity.
baggage that they're
Yes.
bringing to the I love that idea. That's so
It
fascinating.
also relates to something one of my friends told me. I love sports. I'm always watching sports. And I go to this really nice sports bar and I sit there with my friends and they sometimes bring their wives and so on. And I remember watching this one couple and the wife was really giving the husband a very hard time. And I wanted to understand what was happening. So when he went away, he was playing pool or something. I was sat down with this lady and I wanted to know, why do you do this? Right. And then I realized that she didn't even know she was doing it. But in her culture, she believes you must constantly test your husband to see if he is willing to respond and prove his word to you at all times. And I'm thinking, wow, this is not even about identity. This is about culture. Culture plays such a big role in identity. It's almost you
Yeah.
have culture, and then the way we respond to our culture is identity. And then when I explained this to this lady that, look, if you want to test him, there are other ways to do it without making him so uncomfortable that he's gone to the other side of the bar and playing pool with strangers. There's other ways to test this. And you got to decide, do you test it in everything you do? Do you test it sometimes? Which is the test you want to die on, basically?
I love that. And I love that your solution was to go to the other side of the bar. You want
But
to give
it's
them a real
true.
test, disappear.
But
No,
just think about that, right?
I mean, this whole thing of like culture is identity, and then we often embody our cultural identities without even realizing we're doing it. These become, these norms that are just baked in, and then kind of like through these like social learning processes, we start to embody these things that who knows whether we're even realizing that this has happened. I doubt she sort of consciously would say, yes, I need to explicitly test him all the time, but it's baked into her, the DNA of the relationship at that point,
Yes.
and it's a really hard pattern to break.
But there's a zinger in the story because I then spoke to the husband and he said in his culture, he likes it. He feels it's good when I'm tested. If the lady's not testing me, I don't want to be in this relationship. She doesn't care. Now think about this, right? For me, looking at this is super awkward. But for them, it's a game they have chosen to play.
Yeah.
And imagine if I had watched this and I'd done a case study on this and had never spoken to these people, but watched them on video, I would maybe characterize them as a dysfunctional couple,
Yeah.
not realizing they have evolved to play these roles, which they actually like.
Yeah.
And by him going to the other side of the room, he's making her chase him.
Yeah, I think it's super subjective what awkwardness and what a dysfunctional relationship even looks
Yes.
like. We try in psychology all the time to like code these behaviors of couple conversations and workplace conversations. And often we bring this kind of third party perspective that is just off because it doesn't capture the normal kind of flex and flow or dynamics of the relationship.
Yes.
Relationship scientists would go crazy with, Gottman's four horsemen and say, okay, well, that looks like there's some kind of pattern of stonewalling and kitchen sinking and all these kinds of negative interpersonal dynamics. But from his perspective, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And so the minute
Yes.
she starts ignoring him is when the real red flags are going off. And I love this weird little dance that they have that
Yes.
they do in front of other people
No,
and
it's
other people
interesting to
think is
watch.
weird and it's their weird dance. That's just who they are. That's awesome.
Yeah, it makes me sweat a little bit considering how they fight, but they love it. But it
Yeah.
makes me think about, I have a physics kind of background. It seems like awkwardness is relative to where you are. And depending on where you are, your understanding of awkwardness, or maybe I say appreciation or noticing awkwardness is going to change. Is that a good way to think about it?
Absolutely. I think we don't even know if two people agree on whether an interaction was awkward.
Yes.
I think we can kind of watch extreme cases of awkwardness and identify it, but most of us live in the margins most of the time. And I think we don't even know if I felt awkward, you also felt awkward. And we tend to project our own feelings of awkwardness onto other people. And so even though you have to kind of participate in some way, that doesn't mean you even felt the thing that I thought you participated in. So there's just a whole bunch of uncertainty around what people are thinking and feeling. But you're making me kind of rethink my work on this. Like, can we even operationalize it in a clear way that everyone would agree? That's awkward. That's not awkward. That's an in between. I actually don't know. But I think it's a fascinating question.
Well, that's the most important thing about your work. the fact that you don't know gives you new work to do. I mean, that's the whole
Yeah,
point of research, right? You
once
never
you know
really
the
know.
answer, life's boring.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. And it's so nuanced because sometimes I'll watch someone be offended with one person doing X, but when another person does X, they're okay with it. It's
Yeah.
almost we've given people different permission levels. And it's not about the act, it's the permission level we've given someone where we allow them to do something, which we then say is normal, but someone else does not have this permission to do the same thing. So the act is important, but it's largely irrelevant when you consider the permission levels because we need to know the permission levels first.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described is almost exactly how we operationalize social status in research on status and hierarchies in the workplace. And so if one person can leave, let's say there's an important meeting of 6 people in the
Yes.
room, if one person has permission, and I mean that implicitly, to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the meeting when the CEO is speaking, um, and they get up and they do it and no one says anything, and then the minute they walk back, someone says, oh, just to let you know what you missed, here's what happened. Another person does the exact same thing. People look at them and say, what, you can't just wait for this to wrap up? That is a marker of status, just being able to do that and not get punished for it. And
Yes.
noticing that is a marker of what we call status acuity, the ability to read a room, to know who has status and who doesn't. And I think, I've learned in my own career that by observing behaviors like that is how you can figure out how important and heard someone is. Little things like who can get up and get coffee in the middle, walk over to the side where the pastries are. Small behaviors like that are huge indicators of status because you're right, not every behavior, we don't all have the same permissions. And when we do it, we're not all violating the same norm. Me doing it might violate a norm that if you did it would be perfectly acceptable, depending on kind of the rank ordering of the people in the room. And I think that makes it interesting and messy, but you're right.
Yeah, I mean, I have a management consulting background and I used to work around the world. And I very clearly saw the different permission levels in different cultures,
Yeah.
whereby I would be talking to a junior consultant in a very conservative country and they wouldn't make eye contact with me because
Mm-hmm.
in their culture,
Yeah.
they don't make eye contact. And I'm sitting there and saying, as a senior partner, if you want to connect with a client, you've got to make eye contact with them.
Right.
That's not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we never think about those things, how personalized it is.
Yeah, I did some cross national work in Abu Dhabi where people, no one's actually from Abu Dhabi. He lives there,
Yes.
very few, it's like 10%. And so we did all these kind of cross national interactions where we had people negotiate, and some people, came from Asia, some from Western countries, and those status cues, those kind of embedded tightness, looseness of the culture, eye contact, accent, forward lean, interruptions, speaking time, pitch, tone, all that stuff was super fascinating to study because, most organizations now are international and you have to have these kinds of one-on-one meetings all the time. And if your status cues are different, if what's considered culturally acceptable is different, you can offend people. You can not get deals. You can, really isolate, the office that is in a different country if you're not careful. But we don't get training on that stuff. I think people are so worried about stereotyping and things like that they
Yes.
don't do any kind of, or they call it cultural sensitivity training, but that doesn't exactly work. It's like a lack of knowledge around acceptability and permission. And I wish we use that language more when
Yes.
describing these things.
It's also really hard to know how to respond to every single culture in the world, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's more a question of how do we be more understanding and be open to the fact that we may not have done anything intentional to upset someone. And as long as we then respond to that and not wonder why this person hates me, maybe it's a better way to handle these things. Because I can't know every culture in the world. There was a country I went through, I can't remember which one, where I made a hand gesture, which means good job in the West, but it was taken very offensively to security at the airport.
Yeah. I love learning about all those things. I learned in cultural anthropology class in grad school.
Oh,
There's a culture.
wonderful.
There is some tribe in Africa where they're constantly killing each other, and this is in the 1700s, and
Yes.
they learned over time that when you get nervous right before you're going to kill your neighbor, your parasympathetic system shuts down. And so basically you get dry mouth. You're not, if
Yes.
anyone's ever given a public speech, you know what it's like to get dry mouth. And so the cultural norm was when you walk over to your neighbor's house, you get as much spit as you can in your mouth and you spit on the floor and of your neighbor's house. And that is an indication that you're not there to kill them because you have enough
I
spit
love that
to be
story.
able to land on the floor. And I'm like, I love that culture, that like, the domain of sort of relevance around that and how they develop that belief around stress and physiology and killing your neighbor. I love stuff like that.
This is a very good point you're raising. I have a client who doesn't speak well. He fumbles his words. It'll take him 4 minutes to tell you his title. Literally 4 minutes. That's how long we took for him to get out his title and get it correct. But he was telling me, Michael, why am I struggling? Why can't I get this right now? What I told him is that you have evolved to be this way because being this way is helping you succeed at something. It's not a disability the way you're seeing it. We all evolve. It's like the story you said about spitting. I'm sure that cultural characteristic has stayed with those people for decades, maybe even centuries. And then when we look at this behavior, we say, this doesn't make sense. But it makes perfect sense if you realize we evolve. By doing these things, we survive. So you have to ask the question, what did it allow us to survive and be good at? And do we still need to survive and be good at those things, right?
Yeah. I like that a lot too because it will help people who have some weird quirks, like taking 4 minutes to get their title out, to not feel stigmatized for the behavior. It's often
Yes.
we're taught that we pathologize so much right now, and we want to label it with some kind of diagnosis, and then we want to embrace that diagnosis as a good thing. But instead, I think you're right. We should take a step back and say, there is an origin story for this behavior. It made sense at one time. People with anxiety issues. It made sense at one time for us to be anxious about all these things. It doesn't
Yes.
make sense anymore, but we haven't kind of out evolved that original reason. And then I think people will feel a lot better about their weird quirks, their awkward things that don't work so much now, but at some point might have.
But it could still work. I mean, I have a close friend who suffers from phobia. She cannot do certain things. And this person feels very bad about it because they feel like they're not a complete person. But I explained to them, look, I know what your phobia is. If you didn't have that phobia, you'd be dead because of the things you would do. So you have to think of this phobia as a way of protecting you because you take big risks in your life and you always have done that. You see your phobia as a disability, and I'm thinking that it evolved to stop you from doing very dangerous things because I know you do dangerous things. And this phobia specifically stops you from doing those dangerous things. So you see it as a disability. I'm thinking it's the only thing keeping you alive at this point. So in
That's
this case,
fascinating.
she should not evolve away from it. I think it's important that she treats this as a positive attribute and protects it and stop punishing herself for not being normal.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. I mean, at that point, I don't even know if you'd want to call it a phobia. It's like a
Exactly.
legitimate,
Superpower.
self-protective fear that's probably a little extreme,
Yeah.
but serves a purpose.
The reason I tell the story is because this person does awkward things because of the phobia. But the awkwardness is, for me, a byproduct of being protected, right?
Yeah.
So worrying about the awkwardness and what people think, you're very successful, you just stay and do what you're doing, right? It's working for you.
Yeah. I mean, that gets into this point of we should probably just be more tolerant around awkwardness and stop trying to outwit it and outrun it at every turn. I think
Yes.
a
I like
lot
that.
of
I love that.
conversations I have, they start with someone saying, I just want to let you know I'm an awkward person, as if it's
Yeah.
some kind of
I'm an awkward.
label that they've decided to lead with so that they don't, that they, I want to let you know I'm really tall before we meet. I'm 18 feet
Yeah.
tall, just so you're not weirded out. I'm really awkward. And it's a little bit of this kind of self-protective mechanism. And instead, I tell everyone, like most of us actually are awkward. Welcome to the club. 90% of humanity is awkward. Animals are even awkward. Raccoons can be awkward. We're all awkward. So don't feel like you need to kind of justify or warn us. It's like a trigger warning. It's an awkward trigger warning. Instead of just, what I remind people is, yeah, most of us are. I'm awkward too. Don't worry about it. It's living in your head more than other people are probably noticing it.
Do you feel that people are worried about being awkward, or they're worried about the attention awkwardness brings them?
That's a really good question. I don't know if it's worse. If you were to give people a choice
Yes.
between you're going to be awkward, but no one's going to notice it, but it's going to live in your head for 20 years and you're going to perseverate on it and you're going to wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, is option one. Or option two is you're going to be awkward. You're never going to feel it, but everyone's going to be talking about you for the next 20 years about that time you're awkward. What would you choose? I think most people would still probably go with the first one, even though they're kind of torturing themselves because the thought of it
Yes.
affecting their reputation is awful. I actually think humanity should go with the second one because then we'd
Yes.
all be walking around a lot more comfortable in our own awkward skins and sleeping well at night and so forth and putting ourselves in more novel social situations, which we don't do anymore. Instead we sit on our phones all day and at home. So, but I think that awkwardness largely lives in your head. I think that when you're perseverating on mispronouncing a waitress's name 20 years ago, I'm pretty sure that waitress has forgotten about that thing because she's thinking about her own awkward thing she did 20 years
Yes.
ago. So,
Is that an
this
actual
perseveration's
example?
a real problem.
Is that
Yeah.
an
I mean,
actual example?
we ran a study where we just had people write down their awkward situations and we were expecting some pretty crazy stuff. And what we got were just really mundane. All of the company went outside and we were waiting for the bus to pick us up for some team building exercise. And I sat on the grass and I fell backwards. Okay, we're waiting for the story. What else happened? That's it. That's the
Nothing.
whole story. I fell backwards. Well, when was this? This was, in 1979. And I
1979.
can't get over it. The average amount of time was 4 years, but we had some older participants. So we had a couple 40 years ago moments and they were all super mundane. These are not crazy things. These are not things that got people canceled online. They didn't make a racist joke on Twitter and wake up with no job. It wasn't even stuff like that. It was, forgetting someone, saying hi, nice to meet you when they had already met them, and mispronouncing names and, just normal stuff. But these were the things that are really sticking in people's minds.
So going back to the way you structured this study, why did you assume there'd be these crazy stories? Why was that the starting point?
I just assume that if we're going to prompt people to tell us about awkwardness, and it could be anything that's happened in the past, that they would bring their A game and they would only write things that would pass some sort of threshold of, if you were to create a Reddit thread, would be highly, highly uncomfortable. And what we got wrong about that is that discomfort lives in your own head, and our objective standards for discomfort in social psychology are so high that we miscalibrated. And part of that, I think, is because I study anxiety in the lab, I
Yes.
study discomfort, and we look at people's physiology, and so we need to know what ramps your physiology up enough so that you look pretty stressed out. And we put people through really extreme things like something called the Trier test, where you have to stand in front of a panel of mean-looking people in real life and count backwards by increments of 17. And then if you get a number wrong, they yell at you, wrong, start over,
Whoa.
or
That's
you give us,
interesting.
we're so mean, or you give a speech on why you make a good friend to a new acquaintance you just met. They came in and, the person, and I've been the Confederate in the study, looks at you and says ooh, I didn't really like that. I don't think I want to be your friend. That speech sucked. So, we do these really awful things to people, and that's our definition of
That will definitely
anxiety.
cause some awkwardness. Because
Oh,
if
yeah.
I was in that study, I would wonder, do they really believe these things they're telling me, or they're just acting because you're paying them $20 an hour, right?
I know. Some people think that, but most cry, I got to be honest.
They cry.
Oh, we have people cry all the time. I mean, we go to great lengths, and these are often real participants doing things like this to each other as well. I think, we run work where you have to interact with someone who is pretty morally reprehensible, and we give you some data on what they're really into dog fighting or whatever weird thing that they like that most people agree is immoral, and then you have to go negotiate with them. And we look at how they act and how they handle that. And, most of them actually bend over backwards. They're super nice to people who are morally terrible people because it's awkward to not be. And so I think that's kind of another interesting layer is even when we interact with people we don't like, we don't trust, we think are
Yes.
immoral, disagree with our politics, all of us say, oh yeah, I would never be friends with this person. I'm going to tell them off the minute we're
Yeah.
in the same room. And they don't. They're like, hi, it's so great to meet you, and then they let them win the negotiation. So that tends to be the kind of normative response.
If you think about work as a relationship, that means you have relationships with your personal life, with your work, and so on. Is it then fair to say that your relationship is never going to be stable because no one has a stable relationship? It's going to fluctuate. There's going to be good times, bad times, questioning times. And that would be normal, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I'm thinking about right now what it looks like to fall out of love with your career and whether stability is an important component of knowing you're no longer in love. And I think for a lot of people who are in committed romantic relationships, they are looking for stability. They're not just looking, to be loved all the time. They're
Yes.
looking, they would even be okay with dropping down the romance scale a few notches, having less feels, but if it's stable, then they feel kind of better about the relationship. Whereas other people, to them, that's not love. That might be commitment, but that feels like companionship. And I think with your work, most of us do expect some level of stability in our feelings, and our job is something we do. We shouldn't be on an emotional roller coaster at work. But what I found in my work is when you're really identified with your career, so when your career is an important
Yes.
component of who you are as a person, you never really get that stability. It is very rare to feel highly satisfied with something that you're super committed to all the time. In fact, most people are relatively low on satisfaction around their identities while being identified with that thing. And I do think you're right. I think a bit of an emotional roller coaster is normal. You want to know what your threshold is for that. But you can be falling out of love with a career that defines you. And I think that is a little bit of a scary feeling. But some people are really tolerant of that kind of ambivalence, that emotional roller coaster, and some people aren't at all. And I think knowing who you are is an important component of knowing what your career should look like, because some careers are inherently roller coastery. They're like a lover that you fight with and
Yes.
then have like amazing makeup sex with. And other careers are just boring and stable, but that's what somebody wants.
And yes,
Um,
this is the classic example of awkwardness, right? You use the word sex in a podcast. If you did that 40 years ago, you would have had people calling you. What is wrong with Dr. West using a word when kids are listening to this? But you see how it changes, right?
I mean, I study relationships. I see overlap between all kinds of concepts that other people are probably like, what does sex have to do with your
Yeah.
career? Well, a lot. Like, think about communication. If you don't communicate early on in a romantic relationship about what you like and what you don't, you're going to have terrible sex the whole time. Same thing with your relationship with your boss. It's just never going
And
to
some
work.
people
So,
find their romantic partners at the office and get married to them. So,
then there's that. I'm married to the guy whose office is 2 doors down from me. So, there's also that overlap for sure. But I think all of this stuff is about communication. It's about difficult
yes.
conversations, about feelings that move up and down, and we don't know what to do with those things. It's about feeling rejected. It's about loving something that doesn't love you back. And I think that's true for romance as well as with your career.
It's layered, right? When you unpack relationships and your relationship with your career, because there's the people you interact with in your career, there's the work you do, there's the company you work at, and there's the customers you interact with. You have to decide which of those are the primary pillar in that relationship. Because for some people, they will leave a company if they're working with the wrong people. It doesn't matter what the company is. If I don't like these people, I'm going. There are other people who will say, well, I love this company. I'm going to put up with these people for the next 2 years and I'll see it through. So you really have to understand the layers in that relationship and understand which one you are willing to tolerate, can go a little bit off, and which one is the one that needs to be not perfect, but best for you. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think too, I was thinking a lot when you're talking about these levels, the structure of the relationships you have at work. Where this really comes up a lot is around conversations around promotion and raises, and people who just can't seal the deal. So they're like chronically runners up, or they're
Yes.
always feeling underappreciated and, undervalued at work. And I think where some of these folks might be misstepping is their priorities of those relationships. So they might say, I love the mission of this company. I love the work we do, but my relationships aren't going so well, but like, I don't care because I'm behind the mission. And that kind of misalignment is what's preventing them from getting ahead.
Yes.
That who cares how much you love the mission if your relationships are going poorly, or imagine your inner office relationships are going great, but you can't client face. The clients don't want you to be the point of contact. That's going to prevent you from ever climbing up in sales. And so you might say, but clients suck, but I love this culture here.
Yes.
Well, then you're not going to get ahead. And so no matter how happy you are, at the end of the day, you're going to kind of suffer from that kind of wrong distribution of priorities of those relationships. And I think that's not something that most people think very deeply about.
And I think when people hear the phrase, which you've well said, is that you have a relationship with your career. The starting point for most people and the end point would be they just think about the people in their career, but you can have a relationship with your company.
Yeah.
You can have a relationship with your role. And that's just as important as the relationships with the people
You
in
can
your
have a
company.
relationship with a career even if you're not employed, because say you spent years and years and tons of money getting the degree that got you there. You can be an unemployed lawyer and have a relationship with a career in law and not be currently working because you identify with all of that stuff that got you there. So I think the career can also often be this kind of nebulous, abstract concept, that even when you're not in one, or even when you're in between jobs, that relationship still exists because you think about it all the time. You go home, you want work-life balance, but you're perseverating on what your next move should be. You're trying to think about who to network with. And so you're actively engaging in that relationship, even though the partner's not doing much for you. And the amount of time we spend thinking about those things is time spent in that relationship. But, I think most of us think much more concretely about the people and the company and those kinds of things.
It's very common in management consulting. It's so common. I'll give you a classic example of this, whereby someone is managed out of McKinsey. We call it counsel to leave, or they don't make partner. I know people who have spent their entire lives trying to prove that they were good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Every decision they make is, how do I do this to show people that it was a mistake to get rid of me?
Yeah.
And they don't realize that they are still working for that company.
Yeah.
I mean, the most common example I see with people is they rebel against their parents, and every decision they make for the next 30 years is the opposite of what they think their parent would want them to do. But they don't realize their parents are still, in inverted commas, controlling them, not directly, but just through avoiding what they thought their parents wanted. And it takes them, some people never realize they're doing it.
Yeah.
They're not being their own person. It's a similar example, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all have those heartbreaker relationship partners that we're still trying to convince through all of our fun, sexy photos on social media that they made a mistake. I think the McKinsey example is great. It's like, I will spend the rest of my life, McKinsey broke my heart. I will spend the rest of my life convincing McKinsey. McKinsey's moved on, but
yeah, exactly. McKinsey has
doesn't
moved
know
on.
I exist. McKinsey has moved on. McKinsey's remarried with 3 kids, and she forgot about me. But I'm still living that life of trying to convince this organization. And people do have these really strong identities with certain organizations that they've worked with.
Yes.
Sometimes it's their first job, sometimes it's their highest status job, and they still talk about it like it's yesterday.
Yes.
My husband is from Alberta, and they're like oil people up there, and they talk about their Chevron identity. I mean, they have these Chevron tattoos on their arms, like an actual Chevron.
Wow.
I'm like, why would you get that? They're like, because
someone
I'm a
loves
Chevron
oil
man.
companies.
They
Someone
love
loves
big
oil
oil.
companies.
But they don't love all big oil. They love
Yes,
Chevron.
of course.
So, you'll hear things like, I'll visit his family. Remember in 1986 when Chevron gave us those bonuses? Like, that was a good year.
Wow.
They talk about it in these nostalgic ways that it's like their spouse died or something. And I think it's fascinating when people can't let go of the identity of an old organization they used to work for, and they're still trying to prove them to themselves, or to that, it's probably more themselves than the organization, that they were worthy.
So there's no awkward big oil discussions in Calgary, I'm getting that. If you're in the oil and gas industry, go to Calgary is what I'm hearing. Have all your conferences there, have your vacation, people will love you.
all your people will be there. No one will hate on fracking or anything like that.
That's
You will be
amazing.
among like-minded others.
That's interesting. So let's just change the discussion a little bit, yeah, right?
Sure.
Let's think of our listeners, right? All over the world, ex-consultants, senior people in industry now, venture capital, private equity, a lot of hedge fund people, and so on. Is there something that you would want them to do on Monday morning, 8 a.m., so they become better at using what we've been talking about? What is the thing that they could do when they get in on Monday morning, 8 a.m., where they could say, I've done this and I'm improving in this way?
I think the smartest thing that we can do, and this is true no matter how happy you are at work, is to actually start collecting data on your own patterns to understand what leads you to be stressed at work, what leads you to disengage, and do the same thing for the people who work with you. And I'll give you a really simple example that I think can actually kind of move the needle quite a bit on understanding why people start to fall out of
Yes.
love with their job or whatever. There's a daily stress test I have in my book that asks you just two questions in the morning. What do you think the most stressful thing is going to happen to you today is? And what's kind of the best thing that you think is going to happen
Yes.
to you? And then in the evening, you do the same thing. What was the most stressful thing? What was the best thing? And was the stressful thing the thing you thought would be the most stressful thing? 50% of the time, the most stressful thing is not the same thing. Turns out we're pretty good at putting building blocks in place when we anticipate stressors. But what's fascinating is the other 50% of the time when people said, I got totally stressed out by, say, my commute that ran too long or a meeting or whatever, I didn't anticipate it. And then I say, well, has this happened to you before? Almost always yes. And so we often get stressed out by the same repeated things, but we don't encode them as stressors. And then when we experience them, they lead to a cascade of negative effects of disengagement, of yelling at
Yes.
people, of bringing that stress home. So the one thing I tell you to do is run my daily stress test on yourself. Ask the people who report to you to do it for a week and look for patterns. And then once you see those patterns, you can start putting small steps in place to actually prevent those so-called unanticipated stressors from actually happening. And these are usually really small things that we're routinely experiencing, but it's a little like fighting with your spouse about money every night. You're so
Every
used to
night.
it. You don't get it. Yeah, I mean, I grew up poor, so I heard a lot of this in my house. You get used to it and you don't encode it as a stressor anymore. And once you do that, you're in the danger zone because it's affecting you physiologically. It'll affect your sleep and your health, but you're not in the moment noticing it as a stressor until someone asks you or you're prompted to write it down. Was that stressful? Oh yeah. So it takes a little bit of reflection. So, that's kind of the one thing that I found, no matter what your issues are at work, keeping track and collecting data on what is stressing you out. The other kind of small thing I would recommend is that a lot of what keeps us tethered to jobs that aren't giving much back is intermittent reinforcement. Your boss is nice to you, then they're rude to you. Your team loves you, then they hate you. And they're doing it on a schedule that's hard to predict. And actually, that lack of prediction keeps you tethered to things that aren't very nice to you, including careers. And so measuring that pattern of reinforcement and the predictability of that can do a lot just to give you some insight into, am I being yoked into something that's reinforcing me in this way that's making me addicted to it, even though it's not making me happy? And that, again, is just about collecting a little bit of data on yourself over a week or so. So those are the kind of two things that I think can actually give people a lot of insight into why they might be struggling or unhappy at work. And they're pretty easy to do.
I like that. I'm going to try that as well. Start a journal and collect these things. You
Mm-hmm.
raised two important points here. When we deal with clients, we have clients all over the world, but they really accomplished people. These are guys that went to Harvard, Stanford, Wharton. They work for the big firms, KKR, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and so on.
Yeah.
One of the most common things I've seen with all these people, and I mean almost all of them, is they are waiting for acknowledgement that they are worthy.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for someone, usually it's a parent, to tell them, you've done it.
Mm-hmm.
And they spend their whole lives doing things to get told, yes, you've done a great job, you've made it. And the reason I bring this up is because of something you said, which I thought was very important that gets lost in this conversation, is that we don't always consider the physiological effects of awkwardness and stress. Because I've seen some of these people physically age because of the stress they experience when they meet parents over Thanksgiving, Christmas, and they never get told, you did it. You did
Yeah.
what we wanted you to do. And, that's the thing. We talk about awkwardness and relationships like it's things that exist in our mind, but it has a physical bearing on us.
Yeah.
It changes the people we are, the way we look. It has health problems. It's not something that, oh, it's just touchy-feely stuff. This
No.
is physiological.
Yeah.
One of the things that our CEO says is that trauma is a generational change. It stays with you for generations, and you can hand it off to your kids if you're not careful with it. And I was never into touchy-feely stuff until I started talking to people, and I realized that you can't always solve their problems by telling them how to analyze a balance sheet. The issues are usually not technical, but it's that dance they are doing with people that they want acceptance from, and they don't get it. In fact, there's a really good book that came out. It's called We Run the World or To Run the World. It's a rewrite of the Cold War.
Yeah.
But it says that the reason the Soviet Union acted that way is not because of communism. It's because they did so much to defeat the Germans, but were never treated as equals by the Americans. They just
Yeah.
wanted the Americans to say, you are equal, but they never got it. And they did all these irresponsible things just to be seen as a peer. And to me, that's such a fascinating lens to apply to these things, right?
I love that. This idea that we're all waiting around for our parents or whoever to say, you did it, you made it.
Yeah.
I've been in that same situation. And, at work, we get rewarded for doing our jobs well with more work, right? Like
Yes.
that's the version of you did it, you made it. Here's
Yeah.
another task. And so we have to learn to read those tea leaves. But at a certain point, and I have to have this conversation with myself all the time as someone who's promoting a book, and I never feel like I did it, I made it. It is
Yes.
100% up to me to say you did it or made it. It is no one else is ever going to do that for you. I mean, maybe you'll be lucky with a nice mom or dad, but most of us, that conversation has to happen internally and all
Yes.
the time. You have to remind yourself of what you've done, and that you did it or you made it is a mental state. It's not an actual
Yes.
accomplishment. It's a state of mind. It's a way of being. It's not, it's not anything else. So like if you're constantly striving and you're feeling the physiologic stress responses of that, you can't blame that on mommy and daddy
Yeah.
or your boss. That's because you don't have conversations with yourself in the shower when you wake up in the morning.
Yes.
You're not making an effort to tell yourself that you did it and you made it. And I'm guilty of this. I feel like a failure all the time. Doesn't matter that I'm a full professor and I do this and that. It's how many requests for podcasts did I get today? I make up a new thing every day to
Yeah.
tell myself I didn't make it. And it's a terrible state of mind, but people do this. They create these sort of abstractions to say, if I do X, then I'll be able to say I did it or made it. But it's a moving target and it's a little bit arbitrary, and you're yoking your emotional well-being to it. And I think it's a very dangerous place to be. So that really resonates with me, that idea. And I think it takes work and it takes conscious effort to tell yourself those things, but it's not really something that can even come from another person.
Obviously, most of my clients have this problem, but I've started trying to help them with it. And one particular client that I've known for a very long time, over a decade, I knew her when she was doing a PhD, when she went into all the elite consulting firms, and now she's a senior executive in financial services. And when we have conversations, she always tells me that I want to become an executive board member or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's been consistent for her for over decades. She worked really hard. I mean, went to all the best schools. And then I had a conversation with her one day. I said, why do you want to do this? And she said, well, one is for me, but the second one is because my father never made it into the executive ranks. And then I asked her, did you ask him if he wants you to get into the executive ranks?
Yeah.
And I said, you need to ask him, go have that conversation. And he said, I'm not interested in that. I want you to have a baby. That's what I want from you.
Yeah, sounds familiar. That was my family.
And I'm thinking to myself, this lady has spent her entire life pursuing this without checking the assumption, right? I mean, entire life.
She probably knew the baby thing, but discounted it and said, okay, whatever.
Yes.
But you really still want me to be an executive board member,
No, the father
right?
said, I'm not interested in that. I want you to be happy, and I think you'll be happy with having a family and a kid.
Yeah.
And now her entire strategy in life has changed.
Really? So she really just needed that feedback conversation. She needed her dad to release her from that.
Exactly. She felt she had a filial obligation In
Hmm.
certain cultures, you need to do things to please your parents. I think it's in every culture, it's just different degrees.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, it's such a fundamentally different strategy. And she didn't check the assumption. And she puts herself through so much stress trying to get promoted and do these things to get acceptance that was built on the wrong assumption.
Yeah, I would have a conversation with her about you probably shouldn't yoke all your decisions to what you think your parents want you to do.
Exactly.
And I mean, what if she can't get pregnant? Is it like, God, now
That's
I got to do a
interesting.
new thing? I think it's a dangerous place, and a lot of us live there. I'm around a lot of professors whose parents are big
Yes.
deals and are Nobel laureates, and every day
Yes.
I am grateful that my dad was a construction worker. That
Yeah.
that I did not feel that pressure to gain more status, to, we talk about sort of distance traveled. And I joke to, my Mont Blanc, committee board members in
Yes.
Germany that your distance traveled has dropped because your dad is a Nobel laureate. Mine, on the other hand, I grew up around a construction zone. Mine's pretty
Yes.
far, and
Yes.
there is something about these legacy. And you talked about intergenerational trauma, and we often kind of don't think about it this way, especially among elite educated
Yes.
people who are CEOs and board members, that they could potentially be suffering a little bit from that kind of expectancy based achievement that is intergenerational, and it's very stressful for children of extremely well accomplished parents.
Oh, of course it is. I mean, I would think that even though we don't see it that way because we see the privilege of having parents with this power and these connections,
Yeah.
but imagine having to operate at that level continuously, especially if it's not natural for you to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, in New York, you see this all the time because the high school placement is a super stressful experience. And these parents are like, my kid is extra special and super talented, and they need to go to the best schools. And sometimes the kid just, there's nothing wrong with them. Their IQ is just not that high, and they have no
Yes.
business being on this track. But there's a denial among the parents. And so the kids ends up suffering from that denial, and they're, kind of shoved in a direction that is incredibly stressful. So, there is a lot about fit that we don't talk about, and expectations, and being smart enough, and, not wanting to actually have that management role, and that's okay. And I think we're in such a culture of striving that it's not even socially acceptable to say, I don't want more responsibility or a raise or promotion. I actually want to be sort of demoted. That sounds great,
Yes.
and I think that's okay too.
Well, I think, the example I use with clients is for a lot of us, we lock ourselves into decisions as teenagers. I mean, most of my clients and myself as well, we decided when we were 15, roughly the career path we were going to follow. So
Hmm.
we go to high school, we go to undergraduate, then we do graduate studies. Then we work for 15 to 20 years to become a partner or a surgeon. And then at the age of about 35 or 40, we reach the goal, but then we end up not liking it
Yeah.
because we made a decision when we were 15 years that's going to take us about 20 to 30 years to hit. And only after you've done all of this do we realize, hold on a second, I don't like operating on people. It doesn't give me joy. Oh, I don't like being a senior partner. I just got to travel all over the world and listen to people's problems. So we make these decisions when we are really, really young and we're not really equipped to make them. And then we really punish ourselves for not being more aware of it. And this is a common thing with very successful clients whereby they thought that becoming a senior partner was going to make them happy. They felt it would lift everything and all the sacrifices they had to make, but nothing really changes when you get there.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen this in many clients whereby they just lose focus, they lose track of things. Some stay in because they have to, they've got mortgages to pay and so on. But it's a great example where I see clients start doing what we would call awkward things because they no longer have that purpose that's driving them. Usually they would stay on point, but when that focus went away, they start picking up bad habits, doing things badly.
Yeah.
So, the reason I'm bringing this up is because awkwardness is such a deep field. You need to really know what drives it, right?
Yeah, and I think, having that kind of identity crisis is pretty common. I think, you know, you brought up physicians and surgeons, and they're kind of the classic case of this thing defines me and I hate it.
Yes.
But you see that a lot among people who have worked since they were 15. It's really common among first generation of immigrant families where the
Yes, yes,
parents guilt them and say, you know how hard it was for me to get you here,
yes.
and then many of them are really good at their jobs. And so they have companies that intentionally embed them in the workplace. And, so their personal lives and their work lives are all part of kind of one sticky, intricate web. They can't pull themselves out of it very easily. And smart organizations do that intentionally so people can't leave. And I think that is a very existential place to be. And kind of one common experience I see with people like this is this kind of anxious boredom where they're feeling ennui at work. They feel kind of dragged down in this very existential way, and they're bored and anxious at the same time because they have to do the work, but they anticipate it's going to be awful, and that makes them anxious. And they're so well rehearsed at it and so professional at it that it doesn't challenge them, and that makes them bored. And those two things don't usually co-occur, but anxiety and boredom, but I think they can in kind of that unique quadrant among people having an identity crisis. And I think it's like leaving a marriage that you're in for 40 years. Who am I outside of this? I don't even know what I am or who I am because I've been doing this since I was 15 years old. Now that you say that, I actually realize that was me too. I started this career path at 15
Wow,
as a
15 years. So
psychologist. Yeah.
at 15 years, you had sort of the rough direction of going into psychology and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I was taking a college level psychology course my junior year of high school, and then I became a major. And by freshman year, I was working in a research lab with the person who is now my best collaborator. Then I went straight and got my PhD and then got a job at NYU. So I took no breaks. I really kind of, now that you kind of put it that way, decided
When
at 15 to
when
do
you were
this.
15 years old, you made one of the most consequential decisions of your life.
That's
That's
horrifying.
an amazing 15-year-old right there. I mean, you deserve a pat
I
on the
was
back.
I was a lucky 15-year-old that I happened to have a good teacher for AP psychology, but no one at 15 should be making that kind of career choice. But I see what you're saying, because to get there by 40, you had to decide at
At
15,
15, yeah.
you know?
I see this a lot with children of very successful clients where they want to follow in their parents' footsteps and they make these decisions really early. In your case, you were lucky. In my case, I was lucky. But a lot of people, the stress that creates when they realize they went down the wrong path. I mean, that hurts people. It's very hard for anyone to understand it because when we talk about our world, it's always about successful people. And
Yeah.
people say, why are you complaining? You work at these amazing firms. You have a great life. You can have a house in whatever it is in New York, well, rich areas are.
Yeah.
But everything is relative.
Yeah, and then there's the whole cost of what it
Oh,
costs
yes.
for you to do this. And I think in my book, I talk about someone who, when she decides to make a career pivot, it's not just, kind of humiliating and expensive, but there's all this family guilt because at this point she has little kids.
Yes.
Okay, so for me to make a career pivot, that means I'm not going to be home for dinner 5 nights a week. And, my mom went back and got her master's of education when I was in kindergarten. And I remember she would sit in her old Toyota in the driveway of our house and study. And that was, we had a small house, and that was the only place that was quiet where there weren't sounds of,
Yes.
playing children. And I remember thinking, like, what a weird mom. Like, who sits
Yes.
in the driveway of the car? But now I'm old and I see, okay, I get why she did that. I've like hid in the bathtub before to do work. But that decision comes with all kinds of emotional costs. The neighbors think it's weird. Her children are going to
Yes.
complain about it. She's going to have guilt. And, she got over all those humps to have her dream career, but it was not easy. And I think, a lot of us also feel a lot of shame when we make a career transition because we're used to having status and power. And then we walk in and we are the oldest person in the room and the lowest status. And that's not a comfortable position for a successful person to be in. They don't like that feeling. And it feels like they're getting in a time machine or something, and they don't want to get over that newcomer hump. And, that's what a career transition requires you to do, and not know the hidden curriculum and not know the jargon. People are throwing around acronyms. You don't know what they mean. You
Yes.
feel stupid. So a lot of that kind of shame and guilt and embarrassment comes along with a career pivot. And if you've just made partner, you're weighing all that, against your own
Yes.
existential crisis. And, it's not going to win. You're just going to be in an existential crisis. You're probably not going to make that choice.
Well, what I tell every client, And it's a good place for us to wrap up, which is considered one of the best podcasts we've done. So I want to thank you for an amazing conversation.
Oh, this is awesome. Yeah.
But what I always tell people is that no matter what decision you make, no matter what you do, you are going to have regrets and you're going to feel bad about it. So people spend a lot of time agonizing about doing the right thing. And I tell them, you are going to upset people in your life no matter what you do. You can do everything right, but if people don't like you, they're going to think you're a bad person. You can't control that. Don't worry about regrets. Do what you feel is right. That's the best advice I can give you. Don't do what you know with certainty is right because you're never going to have certainty.
Yep.
Don't try everything because you don't have the time in life to try everything, right? I mean, I can't go and live in every city in the world to figure out which city I like. I've got to kind of loosely realize I like the beach, I like sunshine, and I like Mexican food. So, it's pretty easy for me, right?
Yeah, that all sounds great.
People need to know there is no perfect answer that's going to make you happy. There's always going to be regrets. And as long as you embrace that, I think you will not feel so bad about things.
There's always going to be regrets, and there is no certain path. Do not wait for certainty to show up. Do not wait to change your career for that magical light switch to go on in your head that says, okay, I think the final nail is in the coffin. Now it's time. Uncertainty, ambivalence are just all part of the process. And I think waiting for resolution to happen to you is probably one of the biggest mistakes people make. So I love this approach and just embracing that not everyone's going to be happy. And you might not be happy with yourself too, and that's fine. It waxes and it wanes. It goes up and down.
Yeah, I always tell people, don't worry about how you look. If you believe in yourself, you are automatically an attractive person. People always worry about what they're wearing. And I say, look, if you have certainty in yourself, not certainty in what you know, you're going to look great if you're wearing a potato sack. Tessa, thank you so much. We are definitely going to have you back.
Yes, I would love to do that. This has been awesome. You've made me think all about my life choices in a pretty terrifying way.
Get people to think.
Great,
thank you so much. We definitely will have you back. We'll wait for you to do some new research and we can discuss it.
Sounds
Take care.
Great.
Ciao.
Take care.